She helped an old man, not knowing he was the CEO's secret grandfather. Hello, let's hear another incredible story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. I love narrating stories for you, so get ready. Let's start. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced through Imani Field's dreams at 6:15 a.m., dragging her from a peaceful sleep where bills didn't exist and her boss wasn't a passive-aggressive nightmare. She groaned, rolling over in her small Chicago apartment bedroom, her dark curls splayed across the pillow like a wild crown. "Imani, baby, you better get moving," her grandmother's voice called from the kitchen, accompanied by the familiar sounds of breakfast preparation. "And the weatherman says it's gonna pour cats and dogs today." Imani smiled despite herself. Grandma Rose had been saying the same thing every morning for 3 years, ever since moving in after Grandpa's passing. The woman had an uncanny ability to predict Chicago weather better than any meteorologist, and her morning commentary had become as essential as coffee. Padding to the window, in her oversized Northwestern University t-shirt, Imani pulled back the curtains to reveal a sky the color of charcoal, heavy with the promise of rain. The city looked like it was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. "You were right, Grandma," she called out, heading to her cramped closet. "And it looks like Mother Nature's having one of her moods." 20 minutes later, Imani sat at their small kitchen table, inhaling the aroma of Grandma Rose's famous buttermilk pancakes. Her grandmother, a petite woman with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, bustled around the kitchen with the energy of someone half her 72 years. "So," Grandma Rose said, settling down with her own plate and giving Imani that look, the one that meant she was about to dive into her favorite subject. "That nice boy from the grocery store asked about you again yesterday." Imani nearly choked on her orange juice. "Grandma, Marcus is sweet, but he's not—" "Not what?" "Not good enough for my granddaughter who spends her evenings analyzing spreadsheets instead of analyzing men." Rose's eyebrows arched knowingly. "Baby, you're 30 years old. Your biological clock isn't just ticking, it's playing a whole symphony." "I'm focused on my career right now," Imani replied, though they both knew it was only half true. Her job at TechCore Solutions was more survival than passion. As an HR analyst, she spent her days buried in data about employee satisfaction, while her own job satisfaction flatlined. Rose's skeptical hum spoke volumes. "And how's that working out for you? Still dealing with that man-child supervisor who takes credit for your ideas?" Imani's jaw tightened. Her supervisor, Derek, had indeed stolen her proposal for improving employee retention rates just last week, presenting it to upper management as his own brilliant insight. The memory still stung like a fresh wound. "It's temporary," Imani said, more to convince herself than her grandmother. "Like something better will come along." "Something better won't come knocking on your door, baby girl. Sometimes you have to open it yourself." As if summoned by their conversation, the first drops of rain began pattering against the window. Imani glanced at her phone. 7:45 a.m. She needed to leave soon if she wanted to catch the 8:10 train. "I have to go, Grandma." "Thanks for breakfast." She kissed Rose's cheek, breathing in the familiar scent of vanilla and wisdom that always clung to her grandmother. "Take your umbrella," Rose called as Imani grabbed her purse and light jacket. "It's just a drizzle." "Child, I've lived through more Chicago storms than you've had hot meals. Trust your grandmother." But Imani was already out the door, jogging down the 3 flights of stairs from their apartment. The morning air felt thick with humidity, and the gentle drizzle was quickly intensifying into something more substantial. By the time she reached the L station, the drizzle had transformed into a steady downpour. Imani cursed under her breath, pulling her jacket tighter as she hurried down the sidewalk. Her phone buzzed with a text from her co-worker, Jessica. "Train delays due to weather. Gonna be late." Perfect. The day was already off to a stellar start. As she turned the corner toward the station entrance, something caught her eye. An elderly man sat slumped against the brick wall of a closed storefront, rain soaking through his thin jacket. His grey hair was plastered to his head, and he seemed disoriented, maybe even hurt. Imani's steps slowed. Other commuters rushed past him, too absorbed in their own morning urgencies to notice the old man's distress. She should keep walking. She was already running late, and getting involved with a stranger could complicate her day in ways she couldn't afford. But as she drew closer, she saw him try to stand and stumble, his hand pressed against his forehead. There was a small cut above his eyebrow, and his clothes suggested he wasn't homeless, just lost and possibly injured. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "Sometimes you have to open the door yourself." Imani stopped walking. "Oh dear, are you okay?" She approached cautiously, crouching down to his level. The man looked up at her with sharp blue eyes that seemed incongruous with his disheveled appearance. Despite his obvious distress, there was an intelligence there, a spark that made her pause. He began, and then stopped, as if struggling to remember something important. "I think I fell. Everything's a bit foggy." Without hesitation, Imani shrugged off her jacket and draped it over his shoulders. The rain immediately began soaking through her blouse, but she didn't care. "Let's get you somewhere dry," she said, helping him to his feet. "And there's a coffee shop just around the corner." As they walked slowly together, the old man leaning slightly on her arm, Imani couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this choice to stop and help, was going to change everything. She just had no idea how right she was. The warmth of Brewster's Cafe enveloped them like a hug as Imani guided the elderly man through the door, the familiar scent of roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries, a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm outside. The small neighborhood cafe was nearly empty, save for a couple of early commuters hunched over their laptops and an elderly woman reading the Tribune in the corner booth. "Table for two?" asked Casey, the tattooed barista who knew Imani's order by heart. "Just somewhere quiet," Imani replied, helping her unexpected companion to a booth near the window. She settled across from him, studying his face more carefully now that they were in better light. The man was probably in his 70s, with distinguished features weathered by time and what looked like a lifetime of hard decisions. His clothes, though now damp and disheveled, were quality wool trousers, a cashmere sweater, and leather shoes that had cost more than Imani's monthly transit pass. This wasn't someone who'd been living on the streets. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying a slight rasp. "I'm not usually this helpless." There was something almost irritated in his tone, as if his current state offended his very nature. "We all have our moments," Imani said gently. "I'm Imani, by the way." "Alfred," he replied after a moment's hesitation, as if he were testing the name on his tongue. "And you're either very kind or very foolish, helping a stranger like this." "Why can't I be both?" Imani grinned, signaling Casey for 2 coffees. "Besides, my grandmother always said kindness is the one thing that doesn't cost anything but somehow makes you richer." Alfred's sharp blue eyes studied her face. "Smart woman, your grandmother. She has her moments, usually when she's trying to convince me to date the grocery store clerk." That earned her a genuine chuckle. "And you're not interested in the grocery store clerk?" "I'm interested in a lot of things. Grocery store clerks just aren't one of them." Imani accepted the steaming mugs from Casey with a grateful nod. "What about you, Alfred? What were you doing out in the storm?" Alfred's fingers wrapped around the coffee mug, and she noticed his hands trembling slightly. "I was meeting someone, an old colleague. We had words." His jaw tightened. "I may have stormed out rather dramatically. Apparently, I'm not as steady on my feet as I used to be." Ah, the dramatic storm out. A classic move. "I've done a few of those myself." Imani sipped her coffee, watching as Alfred's color slowly returned to normal. "Want to talk about it? Sometimes strangers make the best listeners." "You don't know me," Alfred said, but there was curiosity in his voice rather than dismissal. "Exactly. No judgment, no history, no expectations. Just 2 people sharing coffee while the world drowns outside." Alfred was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the rain-slicked street. "Have you ever built something?" he said finally. "Something you poured your heart and soul into, only to watch others tear it apart piece by piece?" Imani thought about her job. about Derek stealing her ideas, about all the proposals she'd written that had been dismissed or credited to someone else. And there are more times than I'd like to admit. Then you understand the temptation to burn it all down rather than watch it crumble slowly. I understand the temptation, Imani said carefully, but I also understand that sometimes the people trying to change things aren't trying to destroy them. Sometimes they're trying to save them. Alfred's gaze snapped back to her, sharp and assessing. You speak like someone who's been underestimated. Daily, Imani laughed, but there was an edge to it. I work in HR for a tech company. I'm a 30-year-old black woman with ideas about how to make the workplace better for everyone. Take a guess how often my insights are welcomed with open arms, and yet you keep trying. What's the alternative? Give up. Let the world stay broken because fixing it is hard. Imani shook her head. My grandmother didn't raise a quitter. Alfred smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face. I think I would like your grandmother. She'd probably try to set you up with her bridge partner, Mrs. Chen. Fair warning. Noted. Alfred's smile faded slightly. You know, you remind me of someone I used to know. Someone who believed in fighting for what was right, even when it was difficult. Past tense. We lost touch. Pride is a terrible thing, Imani. It builds walls when we should be building bridges. Before Imani could respond, her phone buzzed insistently. A text from Derek. Where are you? Management meeting in 20 minutes. Don't make me look bad. Work? Alfred asked, noticing her expression. The never-ending story. Imani sighed, glancing at the time. I should probably get going. But what about you? Do you have someone you can call? Somewhere to go? Alfred reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone that looked like it cost more than Imani's monthly salary. I'll be fine. Don't worry about an old fool caught in the rain. But as he stood to leave, Alfred swayed slightly, gripping the table for support. Imani was on her feet in an instant. Hey, easy there. Maybe you should see a doctor about that cut on your head. I said I'm fine, Alfred snapped, but the harshness in his voice seemed directed more at himself than at her. Imani pulled out her phone and quickly typed in her number. Look, I know we just met, but you helped me realize something today. Sometimes people need saving, and sometimes they need to be the ones doing the saving. If you need anything at all, call me. She pressed the paper with her number into his hand. Alfred looked down at it, then back at her face. You really don't know who I am, do you? He asked quietly. Should I? No, he said, and there was something almost relieved in his voice. No, you shouldn't. As Imani gathered her things and prepared to face whatever disaster awaited her at TechCore Solutions, she couldn't shake the feeling that Alfred was carrying secrets much heavier than his age suggested. But she also couldn't shake the memory of his smile when she'd made him laugh, or the way his eyes had lit up when she'd talked about fighting for what was right. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, but Imani had a feeling that her life was about to get much more complicated. Imani burst through the glass doors of TechCore Solutions' sleek downtown headquarters, her damp hair still showing traces of the morning storm. The lobby's pristine white marble and floor-to-ceiling windows usually impressed visitors, but today the sterile perfection felt more like a cold warning than a warm welcome. She rushed to the elevator bank, jabbing the button repeatedly, as if that would somehow make up for the 45 minutes she'd spent helping a stranger instead of preparing for whatever corporate crisis Derek had waiting for her. Rough morning? Jessica Martinez appeared beside her, looking equally frazzled. Her usually perfect makeup was slightly smudged, and her blazer bore the telltale signs of a rushed commute through Chicago's unforgiving weather. You could say that, Imani replied, watching the elevator numbers crawl downward with agonizing slowness. Please tell me you know what this emergency meeting is about. That's just it. Nobody knows anything. Derek's been pacing around the HR floor like a caged tiger since 8 a.m. And there are rumors. Jessica lowered her voice as other employees gathered around the elevators. Rumors about major changes. Corporate restructuring. Imani's stomach dropped. In her 5 years at TechCore, she'd seen enough restructuring to know it was corporate speak for people are about to lose their jobs. The elevator dinged, and they crowded in with a dozen other nervous-looking employees. The ride to the 15th floor felt like ascending to a corporate guillotine. "And do whatever happens," Jessica whispered as they approached the HR department. "We stick together, okay?" But when the elevator doors opened, they were greeted by a scene of barely controlled chaos. The usually bustling HR floor buzzed with an energy that felt more like panic than productivity. Employees huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, while Derek paced near the conference room like a man awaiting his execution. "Fields!" Derek's voice cracked across the floor like a whip. "Conference room, now!" Imani exchanged a look with Jessica before making her way through the maze of cubicles. The conference room's glass walls revealed a table full of senior management she rarely saw outside of company-wide emails, and at the head of the table sat a man she didn't recognize. He was probably in his mid-30s, with dark hair perfectly styled despite the morning's weather, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Imani's monthly rent. His posture was rigid, military straight, and his dark eyes surveyed the room with the calculating intensity of a predator assessing its territory. "Please sit," Derek said, his usual smugness replaced by obvious nervousness. Imani took a seat near the back, trying to make herself invisible while studying the stranger who commanded such obvious deference from her normally arrogant supervisor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Derek began, his voice shaking slightly, "I'd like you to meet Graham Ellison, TechCore's new interim CEO." A collective intake of breath swept the room. Imani felt her own breath catch. Alfred Whitmore, TechCore's legendary founder, had been CEO for over 30 years. Everyone knew he was getting older, but the idea of him stepping down had always seemed theoretical, distant. Graham Ellison stood, and even from across the room, Imani could feel the cold authority radiating from him like winter air. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, precise, and utterly without warmth. "TechCore Solutions has been operating under outdated paradigms for too long," he began, his gaze sweeping the room like a spotlight searching for weaknesses. "And the market efficiency demands immediate and decisive action. Over the next 30 days, we will be implementing a comprehensive restructuring designed to eliminate redundancy and maximize productivity." Eliminate redundancy? Imani's hands clenched in her lap. She'd heard this corporate doublespeak before. It meant layoffs. The Human Resources Department, in particular, has become bloated and inefficient, Graham continued, and Imani felt her world tilt. "And we will be reducing HR staff by 60%, effective immediately." The room erupted in shocked murmurs, but Graham's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Those positions deemed essential will be re-evaluated based on merit and measurable contributions to company objectives. Sentiment and tenure will not factor into these decisions." Imani found herself on her feet before she realized she'd moved, her grandmother's voice echoing in her mind. "Sometimes you have to open the door yourself." "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. Graham's cold gaze fixed on her, and she felt like a mouse that had just declared war on a hawk. Yes. I'm curious about the metrics you'll be using to evaluate measurable contributions," Imani said, her heart hammering but her voice steady. "Because if you're only looking at traditional productivity measures, you're going to miss the human elements that actually drive company success, employee satisfaction, retention rates, cultural cohesion." A muscle in Graham's jaw twitched. "And you are?" "Imani Fields, HR analyst. And I've spent the last 3 years developing comprehensive data models that show direct correlations between employee engagement initiatives and revenue growth. If you're making decisions about the HR department without considering that data, you're not eliminating inefficiency, you're creating it." The silence in the room was deafening. Imani could practically hear Derek's career aspirations crashing to the floor beside her own, but she couldn't stop now. Biggie, you want to talk about outdated paradigms? She continued, stepping closer to the table. How about the paradigm that treats employees like expendable resources instead of the human capital that actually generates innovation and drives growth? Graham's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Imani thought she saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, or curiosity. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Interesting perspective. Ms. Fields, he said finally, his tone revealing nothing. I look forward to reviewing your comprehensive data models. There was something in the way he said it that made Imani's skin crawl, like a cat deciding whether to play with a mouse before eating it. Derek, Graham continued, not taking his eyes off Imani, I want a full breakdown of Ms. Fields' projects and performance metrics on my desk by end of day. Derek nodded so vigorously, Imani thought his head might fall off. As the meeting dissolved into administrative details and nervous chatter, Imani remained standing, locked in a silent staring contest with the man who held her professional future in his perfectly manicured hands. She had just declared war on the new CEO of TechCore Solutions, and she had absolutely no idea what she was going to do next. 3 hours later, Imani sat in her cramped cubicle, surrounded by stacks of printouts and her laptop screen filled with spreadsheets that could either save her career or serve as evidence for her professional execution. The HR floor had transformed from its usual controlled chaos into something resembling a war zone, with shell-shocked employees moving like ghosts between workstations. You're insane, Jessica whispered, sliding into the empty chair beside Imani's desk. She clutched a stress ball shaped like a brain, a gag gift from last year's Secret Santa that had become increasingly relevant. Completely, certifiably, insane. Probably, Imani agreed, not looking up from her screen. But I'm right, and the data proves it. The data isn't going to matter if you're unemployed. Jessica leaned closer, lowering her voice even further. Do you have any idea who Graham Ellison is? I did some digging after the meeting. He's not just some corporate suit. He's the corporate suit, Harvard MBA, former McKinsey consultant, and he once laid off 3,000 people at a manufacturing company in Detroit without blinking. Imani's fingers paused over her keyboard. 3,000. In one day, they called it Ellison's Efficiency Massacre in Business Weekly. Jessica squeezed her stress ball until Imani was surprised it didn't pop. Bah, and you just challenged him to a data-driven duel in front of half the executive team. Good, Imani said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Maybe it's time someone did. The truth was, the more she'd thought about the morning's confrontation, the angrier she'd become. Not just at Graham Ellison, but at the entire system that treated people like expendable line items on a balance sheet. She'd spent 5 years watching talented colleagues get passed over, seeing innovative ideas buried under corporate bureaucracy, and witnessing the slow erosion of everything that made TechCore a place where people actually wanted to work. Imani. Jessica's voice carried a note of genuine concern. I know you believe in this stuff, and I admire that. But sometimes believing isn't enough. Sometimes you have to survive first. Before Imani could respond, Derek appeared at her cubicle like a bad omen in an ill-fitting suit. His face was pale, and there were visible sweat stains under his arms, despite the office's aggressive air conditioning. Fields, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Conference room B. Now. Imani's stomach clenched. Is this about the performance review you promised, Ellison? No. This is about the fact that Ellison wants to see you, alone, in his temporary office. Derek ran a hand through his thinning hair. What did you do to him, Fields? I've never seen a CEO request a private meeting with an analyst-level employee. Jessica and Imani exchanged looks. In corporate terms, private meetings with the CEO fell into 2 categories. You were either about to be promoted to the C-suite, or you were about to be escorted out by security. Given the morning's events, Imani was betting on option 2. 20 minutes later, she stood outside the executive conference room that had been hastily converted into Graham Ellison's temporary office. Through the glass walls, she could see him seated behind a massive desk, reading what appeared to be a tablet while making notes on a legal pad. Even sitting down, he radiated the kind of controlled intensity that made people instinctively lower their voices in his presence. Imani took a deep breath, thinking of Alfred's words that morning about pride building walls instead of bridges. Maybe it was time to build a bridge, even if she suspected Graham Ellison was more interested in burning them down. She knocked twice and entered without waiting for permission. "Miss Fields," Graham said, without looking up from his tablet. "Please sit." The office had been stripped of its previous occupants' personal touches and now felt as sterile as an operating room. Graham had somehow managed to make the space feel smaller just by being in it, his presence filling every corner with an energy that was part magnetic, part menacing. "I've been reviewing your work," he continued, finally looking up. His dark eyes were unreadable, but Imani caught something she hadn't expected: intellectual curiosity. "Are your employee satisfaction correlation models thorough?" "Thank you," Imani said carefully. "I didn't say they were correct." Graham leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Your methodology is sound, but your conclusions are built on a fundamental misunderstanding of corporate priorities, which is that employee happiness and company profitability are inherently linked. They're not. Companies exist to generate value for shareholders, not to provide emotional fulfillment for workers." Imani felt her temper flare, but forced herself to remain calm. "And how's that working out for TechCore?" "Because according to my analysis, we've lost 30% of our top performers in the last 18 months, and our client satisfaction scores have dropped 15 points. Correlation doesn't imply causation. No. But it suggests we should investigate the relationship instead of dismissing it." Imani leaned forward, warming to her subject. "You want to talk about shareholder value? Our employee turnover is costing us approximately $2 million annually in recruitment and training costs alone. That doesn't include the intellectual capital we lose every time someone leaves, or the client relationships that walk out the door with them." Graham's expression didn't change, but Imani noticed his pen had stopped moving across the legal pad. "And do you talk about efficiency?" she continued. "But what's efficient about constantly having to rebuild your workforce? What's efficient about having a reputation in the industry that makes top talent choose our competitors?" "And your solution?" Graham asked, his tone giving nothing away. "Invest in people, not just their productivity, but their growth, their satisfaction, their connection to the company's mission. Create a culture where innovation thrives because people feel valued, not just evaluated. Expensive. Short-term, yes. Long-term, profitable." Imani pulled out her phone and quickly navigated to her notes app. "I've run the numbers. If we implement targeted retention programs for our top 15% of performers, we could save $800,000 annually while increasing overall productivity by 12%. Graham was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to fidget. Finally he spoke. "You're either brilliant or delusional, Ms. Fields. Possibly both. I prefer optimistically realistic." That earned her something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "I have a proposition for you." Imani's pulse quickened. "I'm listening." "Prove it. You have 30 days to demonstrate that your people-first approach can coexist with corporate efficiency. I'm assigning you to lead a pilot program, pick your metrics, design your interventions, show me measurable results. And if you succeed, we'll discuss expanding your approach company-wide." Graham leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "And if you fail, I fail, and you implement your 60% reduction in HR staff." "Exactly." Graham stood, extending his hand across the desk. "Do we have a deal, Miss Fields?" Imani looked at his outstretched hand, then back at his face. She was either about to save her department or sign its death warrant, but as her grandmother always said, sometimes you had to open the door yourself. She reached out and shook his hand. "We have a deal." Imani walked through her apartment door that evening, feeling like she'd been hit by a corporate steamroller. then somehow convinced it to give her a chance to prove steamrollers weren't the answer to every problem. Her feet ached, her head pounded, and she had exactly 29 days and 16 hours to either revolutionize TechCore's approach to human resources or watch her entire department get dismantled. "There's my baby girl," Grandma Rose called from the kitchen, where the smell of her famous pot roast filled the air like a warm hug. "You look like you've been wrestling with the devil himself." "Clothes," Imani said, dropping her purse and kicking off her heels. "I've been wrestling with corporate America. The jury's still out on which one's worse." "Well, come tell your grandmother all about it while I finish dinner. And wash your hands. I don't know what kind of germs you pick up in those corporate towers." 20 minutes later, Imani sat at their small dining table, mechanically eating pot roast while recounting the day's events. Grandma Rose listened with the kind of focused attention that made Imani remember why she'd always felt comfortable telling her grandmother everything, from childhood scraped knees to adult broken hearts. "And so let me get this straight," Rose said when Imani finished. "This new CEO man gave you 30 days to prove that treating people like people is good for business. That's the simplified version, yes. And you said yes." "I said yes." Rose was quiet for a moment, cutting her pot roast with deliberate precision. "A baby girl, you know I raised you to stand up for what's right, but sometimes standing up can look a lot like falling down if you're not careful." "Grandma, I had to. You didn't see the look in his eyes when he talked about laying off 60% of my department. These are good people. Jessica, Roberto from payroll, Linda, who's been with the company for 15 years and has twin daughters starting college next year. I couldn't just sit there and let it happen. I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm saying you better be smart about how you're right." Rose reached across the table and squeezed Imani's hand. "And you better have a plan. I'm working on it. Work faster." As if summoned by their conversation, Imani's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Thank you for the coffee and kindness today. I hope your work situation improved." Alfred Imani smiled, despite her exhaustion. In all the chaos of confronting Graham Ellison and accepting his impossible challenge, she'd almost forgotten about the elderly man she'd helped that morning. It felt like a lifetime ago. "Good news?" Rose asked, noticing her expression. "Just someone I helped this morning, a sweet old man I found in the rain." Imani quickly typed back, "Work got interesting. How are you feeling? Any lingering effects from your fall?" Alfred's response came almost immediately. "Nothing that won't heal, though I may have made some hasty decisions today that I'm reconsidering." "Join the club," Imani replied, then added, "Sometimes hasty decisions lead to necessary changes." Wise words from someone so young. Your grandmother raised you well. She did indeed. Speaking of which, she's threatening to adopt you if you don't start taking better care of yourself. This time, Alfred's response took longer. "I would be honored to have such a fierce protector, though I suspect she would have strong opinions about my current family situation." Imani found herself curious about this mysterious family situation, but didn't want to pry. Instead, she typed, "She has strong opinions about everything. It's part of her charm." "I imagine so." "Imani, may I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you believe people can change, truly change, not just adapt or compromise, but fundamentally become better than they were?" The question caught Imani off guard. She glanced at her grandmother, who was pretending not to watch their text conversation while obviously watching their text conversation. "I have to believe that," she typed. "Otherwise, what's the point of trying to make anything better? And if someone had made mistakes that hurt people they cared about, if pride and stubbornness had built walls where there should have been bridges?" Imani thought about her day, about Graham Ellison's cold efficiency and her own heated response, about the challenge ahead and all the ways it could go wrong. "I think the fact that they're asking the question means they're already changing," she replied. "Now, the hard part isn't admitting you were wrong. The hard part is figuring out how to make it right. You are indeed wise beyond your years." "I'm really not. I'm just stubborn beyond my years. There's a difference. Perhaps stubbornness in service of the right cause is wisdom. Grandma Rose would agree with you. She says the meek might inherit the earth, but they probably won't get decent health insurance. I like your grandmother more with each story you tell. She'd like you too. Fair warning, she's already planning to set you up with her bridge partner. Mrs. Chen, Imani stared at her phone. How did you... Lucky guess. Bridge partners are a grandmother's go-to matchmaking resource. But something about his response felt off, like he knew more than he was letting on. Before she could pursue it, another message appeared. Imani, I want you to know that meeting you today reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that kindness still exists in the world, and sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places. You don't have to thank me for basic human decency, Alfred. Don't I? When was the last time someone stopped to help a stranger without wanting something in return? Imani thought about that. In her corporate world, every interaction seemed to have an angle. Every kindness came with strings attached. Even her challenge with Graham Ellison felt like a high-stakes negotiation rather than a genuine attempt to improve people's lives. Maybe we both needed reminding that good people still exist, she typed. Perhaps we did. Sleep well, my dear. Tomorrow is a new day, full of new possibilities. Good night, Alfred. Take care of yourself. As Imani set down her phone, she found Grandma Rose watching her with knowing eyes. That's not the grocery store boy, is it? No, Grandma, just a friend. Well, your friend has you smiling for the first time since you walked in that door. Sometimes the best connections come when we least expect them. Imani thought about Alfred's gentle humor and surprising insight, then about Graham Ellison's intense stare and intellectual challenge. Two very different men had entered her life in the span of 12 hours, and somehow both had reminded her of who she wanted to be, someone who stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Grandma, yes, baby? What would you do if you had 30 days to prove that love was more powerful than fear? Rose smiled, the kind of smile that held 72 years of accumulated wisdom. I'd start by remembering that the people who need love the most are usually the ones who seem to deserve it the least. As Imani prepared for bed, her mind raced with plans for the pilot program, strategies for winning over Graham Ellison, and thoughts about the unexpected kindness of strangers. She had 29 days to change TechCore's culture, save her colleagues' jobs, and prove that treating people with dignity wasn't just morally right, it was good business. But as she drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought wasn't about corporate strategies or employee retention metrics. It was about Alfred's question, do you believe people can change? She was about to find out. Day 3 of Imani's 30-day challenge began at 6 a.m. with her laptop open on the kitchen table, surrounded by coffee cups, printed research articles, and a legal pad covered in increasingly frantic notes. Grandma Rose moved around her like she was a natural disaster that had taken up residence in their dining room. Baby girl, you've been up since 4. This isn't sustainable. 27 days left, Imani muttered, without looking up from her screen. And I need to have preliminary data ready for Ellison by Friday, which means I need to implement the first phase of interventions by tomorrow, which means I need to finish this proposal by never, if you work yourself into the hospital. Rose set down a plate of scrambled eggs and toast with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. Eat. Then explain to your grandmother how you plan to change an entire company culture in less than a month. Imani finally looked up, realizing she'd been staring at spreadsheets for so long that her grandmother's face looked slightly pixelated. I'm going to focus on 3 key metrics: employee engagement scores, project completion rates, and voluntary turnover. If I can show improvement in all 3 areas within the pilot group, English, baby. Pretend I don't have a PhD in corporate nonsense. I'm going to prove that happy employees work better. Imani took a bite of eggs and felt human again. I'm selecting 20 employees from different departments to participate in targeted interventions, flexible scheduling, professional development opportunities, regular check-ins with management, recognition programs. And this Graham man agreed to this. He agreed to let me try. Whether he actually wants me to succeed is another question entirely. Rose studied her granddaughter's face with the intensity of someone reading tea leaves. What's he like, this CEO? Imani paused, fork halfway to her mouth. It was a simple question, but she found herself struggling to answer it. He's complicated, brilliant, definitely, ruthless. But there were moments yesterday when I thought I saw something else underneath all that corporate armor. Something else, like what? Like maybe he's not as sure about his approach as he pretends to be. Like maybe... Imani shook her head. I don't know, I could be projecting. Maybe I just want to believe that someone who has that much power over people's lives isn't completely heartless. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alfred. Good morning, my dear. How goes your crusade to change the corporate world? Despite her stress, Imani smiled. Over the past 2 days, Alfred had become an unexpected source of encouragement, sending thoughtful messages and asking insightful questions about her work. There was something about his perspective that reminded her why she'd gotten into HR in the first place, the belief that work could be about more than just survival. Day 3 of proving that treating people like humans is good for business, she replied. Jury's still out. I have faith in you. Though I suspect your biggest challenge won't be the data, it'll be convincing those in power to see past their own assumptions. Speaking from experience, more than I care to admit. Sometimes the hardest person to change is the one looking back at you in the mirror. Before Imani could respond, another text popped up, this one from Jessica. Emergency. Ellison's in the building early, and he's asking for you. Get here now. Shit, Imani breathed. Language, Rose chided automatically. Sorry, Grandma, I have to go. Crisis at work. There's always a crisis at work, baby. The trick is figuring out which ones are worth running toward and which ones are worth running away from. 25 minutes later, Imani stood outside Graham Ellison's temporary office, smoothing down her blazer and trying to project confidence she didn't feel. Through the glass walls, she could see him on a conference call, gesturing with the kind of controlled precision that suggested the person on the other end was getting thoroughly dismantled. When he finally hung up and gestured for her to enter, his expression was unreadable. Ms. Fields, you're early. Jessica said it was urgent. It is. Graham pulled up something on his tablet and turned it toward her. I've been reviewing your preliminary proposal. Imani's heart sank. She'd submitted a rough outline the night before, but it was nowhere near ready for serious evaluation. That was just a first draft. It's ambitious, Graham interrupted. Perhaps overly so. You're proposing to measure emotional engagement alongside productivity metrics. Most companies consider those mutually exclusive. Most companies are wrong. Graham's eyebrows rose slightly. Elaborate. Employee engagement isn't some touchy-feely concept that exists separate from business results. It's the foundation that business results are built on. When people feel valued, when they understand how their work contributes to something meaningful, when they trust their leadership, that's when innovation happens. That's when teams exceed expectations instead of just meeting them. And you can prove this? Give me the pilot group in 3 weeks, and I'll prove it. Graham was quiet for a moment, studying her face with that same intense focus that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. There's something else we need to discuss. I've been getting pushback from the board about this experiment. Imani's stomach dropped. What kind of pushback? The kind that questions whether we should be indulging in social experiments during a period of necessary restructuring. Graham's tone was carefully neutral, but Imani caught something underneath it. Frustration, maybe even anger. And some members feel that your approach is fundamentally at odds with fiscal responsibility. Some members, or you, does it matter? It matters to me. If you're looking for an excuse to pull the plug on this, just say so. Don't hide behind board politics. Graham's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Imani thought she'd pushed too far, but instead of the cold dismissal she expected, his response surprised her. "I'm not looking for an excuse, Ms. Fields. I'm looking for results. The board has given us 2 weeks instead of 4. If you can't show measurable improvement in that time frame, the pilot program ends and we proceed with the original restructuring plan." 2 weeks. Imani felt the walls of the office closing in around her. That's impossible. You can't change organizational culture in 2 weeks. Then don't change the culture. Change the results. Graham leaned forward, his dark eyes locked on hers. You show me that your people-first approach can deliver quantifiable improvements in 14 days, or admit that sentiment has no place in business decisions. The challenge hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down in an ancient duel. Imani could feel her pulse hammering in her throat, but underneath the panic something else was rising, the same stubborn determination that had gotten her into this situation in the first place. "Fine," she said, standing up. 2 weeks. But I want complete autonomy over the pilot group. No interference, no second-guessing, no corporate oversight committee breathing down my neck. Agreed, but Ms. Fields, Graham's voice stopped her at the door. Understand that if you fail, you won't just be proving me right. You'll be proving that the idealism you're fighting for has no place in the real world. As Imani walked back to her cubicle, her mind was already racing with contingency plans and accelerated timelines. 2 weeks to save her department, her colleagues' jobs, and her own belief that business could be about more than profit margins. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to Alfred. Challenge just got harder. 2 weeks instead of 4. His response came immediately. Then you'll have to be twice as brilliant. I have complete faith in you. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, those words from a man she'd known for 3 days gave her more confidence than any corporate strategy ever could. She had 13 days and 16 hours to prove that love really was more powerful than fear. Time to get to work. 1 week into her 14-day countdown, Imani stood in conference room C at 7 a.m., facing 20 of TechCore's most skeptical employees. She'd handpicked them from different departments, software developers who'd been passed over for promotions, customer service reps burned out from impossible quotas, project managers drowning in bureaucratic red tape. If she could prove her approach worked with this group, she could prove it worked with anyone. "Let me guess," said Marcus Rivera from IT, slumping in his chair like a man attending his own funeral. "Another team-building exercise where we pretend we're all one big happy family while management figures out which of us to fire next." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Imani had expected this. Years of corporate cynicism didn't evaporate overnight. "Actually, Marcus, I was hoping you'd tell me what would make your job not suck," Imani said, pulling out a marker and walking to the whiteboard. "And I want specifics, not better communication or more resources. I want to know exactly what's broken and exactly how we can fix it." The room fell silent. In 5 years at TechCore, nobody had ever asked them that question so directly. "You want the truth?" asked Sarah Chen from customer service, her voice edged with bitter laughter. "I spend 8 hours a day getting screamed at by customers because our software has bugs that IT knows about but can't fix because management won't approve the resources. Meanwhile, I'm evaluated on customer satisfaction scores that are impossible to meet given the tools we have. Same software bugs we've been reporting for 6 months," Marcus added. "We submit tickets. Management says it's not a priority. Then they blame us when clients complain." Imani wrote, "Communication breakdown," in large letters across the top of the whiteboard. What else? For the next hour, the floodgates opened. Years of frustration poured out. Outdated equipment, contradictory directives from different managers, recognition programs that only rewarded people who were already favorites, professional development opportunities that never materialized into actual development. By the time they finished, the whiteboard looked like a manifesto of corporate dysfunction. "Okay," Imani said, capping her marker. "Here's what we're going to do. For the next 7 days, I want you to forget everything you think you know about how TechCore operates. We're going to fix these problems, one by one, and measure exactly how it affects your work. Just like that, asked David Kim from accounting, his skepticism obvious. You're going to wave a magic wand, and suddenly management will care about our input. No magic wand. But I do have something better. Data they can't ignore, and Ellison's direct authorization to make changes within this pilot group. Imani turned back to the whiteboard. Marcus, you mentioned the software bugs. What if you had direct communication channels with Sarah's team? What if customer complaints went straight to the developers who could actually fix the problems? Marcus straightened slightly. That could actually work. We'd know which issues to prioritize based on real user feedback instead of management's guesswork. Sarah, what if your performance metrics included problem solving and customer advocacy, not just satisfaction scores based on broken systems? Sarah's expression shifted from cynical to cautiously interested. You mean I'd get credit for actually helping customers instead of just keeping them from hanging up angry? Exactly. Imani felt the energy in the room beginning to change. David, what if budget planning included input from the people who actually use the resources? What if we made financial decisions based on operational reality instead of spreadsheet theory? For the first time since the meeting started, David smiled. Finance might actually make sense. Over the next 2 hours, they dismantled every complaint on the whiteboard and rebuilt it as an actionable solution. Cross-departmental communication protocols, revised performance metrics that measured impact rather than activity, weekly feedback loops between frontline employees and decision-makers. By 10 a.m., they had a plan. By noon, they had begun implementing it. By 3 p.m., Imani was fielding calls from department heads demanding to know why their employees were suddenly collaborating across traditional boundaries without proper authorization. Because it works, she told Linda Morrison from legal, who was particularly agitated about the new direct communication channels. Customer complaints are already down 12%, and we've identified 3 critical software issues that have been flying under management's radar for months. But the protocols were the problem, Linda. When Sarah from customer service has to file a formal request that goes through 3 layers of management before reaching Marcus in IT, a 5-minute fix becomes a 5-week bureaucratic nightmare. At 5:30 p.m., as most of the office emptied out, Imani was still at her desk, compiling preliminary data when Graham Ellison appeared at her cubicle. She looked up, expecting to see his usual expression of controlled skepticism, but instead found something that looked almost like curiosity. I've been getting interesting reports about your pilot group, he said. Define interesting. Productivity metrics are up 8% across all participants. Customer satisfaction scores have improved 15% in Sarah Chen's department alone. And Marcus Rivera submitted 3 bug fixes today. Apparently he's been working through lunch to address issues flagged by the new communication protocol. Imani felt a surge of vindication. And the problem, Graham said, pulling up a chair and sitting down across from her, is that you're making the rest of the company look incompetent by comparison. Maybe that's because the rest of the company is being incompetent by comparison. Graham was quiet for a moment, studying the data printouts scattered across her desk. Show me something, he said finally. What? Show me how this scales. You've got 20 people working in perfect harmony because you're personally managing every interaction. What happens when you try to apply this approach to 200 people? 2,000? It was a fair question, and one that had been keeping Imani awake at night. Systems, she said. We create systems that reinforce the behaviors we want instead of punishing them. We train managers to facilitate instead of control. We measure outcomes instead of activities. Expensive. Short-term, yes. Long-term. Imani pulled up a spreadsheet on her laptop. If we can reduce voluntary turnover by just 10% company-wide, we save approximately $3 million annually in recruitment and training costs. If we improve productivity metrics by even 5%, you've calculated the ROI. I've calculated everything, Graham. Implementation costs, training expenses, expected resistance, risk mitigation strategies. This isn't idealism, it's good business. Something shifted in Graham's expression when she used his first name, though she hadn't even realized she'd done it. The formal distance between them seemed to shrink, replaced by something that felt almost like partnership. "Now, you know," he said quietly, "when I took this position, I thought the biggest challenge would be cutting costs and streamlining operations. I didn't expect to find someone who could make me question whether efficiency and humanity are actually mutually exclusive." "Are you saying I'm changing your mind?" "I'm saying you're making me consider possibilities I hadn't considered before." Graham stood up, but instead of leaving, he hesitated. "Can I ask you something, Imani?" The use of her first name sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Sure. What made you so sure this would work?" "Most people in your position would have taken the safe route, kept their heads down, accepted the layoffs, focused on survival." Imani thought about Alfred's text messages of encouragement, about Grandma Rose's unwavering faith, about all the conversations with colleagues who'd stopped believing their work could be meaningful. "Because someone reminded me recently that people can change," she said. "And if people can change, then maybe companies can too." Graham nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he'd been wondering about. "7 days left," he said. "7 days. Imani agreed. But as he walked away, she found herself thinking less about the data she still needed to compile and more about the way his expression had softened when he'd asked about her motivations. Maybe Graham Ellison was changing too. Day 10 of the pilot program found Imani in the office at 10 p.m., running final calculations for the presentation that could save or destroy her department. The building was empty except for security guards and the occasional cleaning crew, but she barely noticed the solitude. Numbers swam before her eyes: productivity increases, cost savings, employee satisfaction scores that had climbed higher than TechCore had seen in 3 years. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching until Graham's voice cut through her concentration. "Working late again." Imani looked up, startled. Graham stood at the edge of her cubicle in shirt sleeves, his tie loosened and his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled. He looked more human than she'd ever seen him, and the sight sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "Could ask you the same thing," she replied. "Don't CEOs have people to work late for them?" "Not when they're trying to figure out how a single HR analyst managed to accomplish more in 10 days than the previous leadership team did in 2 years. Graham gestured to her computer screen. "Mind if I sit? I'd like to understand how you did it." Imani nodded, suddenly aware that her blouse was wrinkled and her hair had escaped its professional bun hours ago. It wasn't magic, just listening to people and giving them the tools to do their jobs better. "Show me." For the next hour, Imani walked Graham through every intervention, every metric, every conversation that had led to the pilot program's success. He listened with an intensity that made her feel like the most important person in the world, asking questions that showed he understood not just the numbers, but the human stories behind them. "This communication protocol between Sarah's team and Marcus," he said, studying her flowchart. "It eliminated 17 hours of bureaucratic processing time per week and reduced customer complaint resolution from an average of 6 days to 18 hours, Imani added. But the real breakthrough was when we stopped treating departments like silos and started treating them like a team working toward the same goal, which is what I should have seen from the beginning." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and honest. Imani looked at Graham's face, really looked at it, and saw something she'd missed before: exhaustion that went deeper than long work days, a kind of weariness that spoke of battles fought and lost long before he'd arrived at TechCore. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "Anything. What happened to you? I mean, you're clearly brilliant. You understand business better than anyone I've ever met, but there's something." She paused, searching for the right words. "It's like you expect the worst from people before they have a chance to show you otherwise." Graham was quiet for so long that Imani thought she'd overstepped. Then he leaned back in his chair and ran a hand through his hair, making it even more disheveled. "My grandfather," he said finally. He built this company from nothing, turned it into something remarkable, but by the time I was old enough to understand business, he'd become distant, focused only on profit margins and market share. We had a falling out about 5 years ago over the direction the company should take. What kind of falling out? The kind where you say things you can't take back, where pride becomes more important than family. Graham's voice carried a weight that made Imani's chest ache. He wanted me to take over eventually, but only if I was willing to make the hard choices, layoffs, cost-cutting, treating employees like expendable resources. I told him he'd lost sight of what made TechCore special in the first place, and now you're doing exactly what he wanted. Ironic, isn't it? Graham's smile was bitter. I spent years that a company should be its profit, and here I am, implementing the exact policies I once fought against. Imani felt pieces clicking into his rigid control, his initial dismissal approach, the way he'd seemed almost surprised by the pilot program success. You weren't trying to prove your grandfather right. You were trying to prove yourself wrong. Graham looked at her sharply. What do you mean? You didn't want my program to fail because you believed efficiency was more important than humanity. You wanted it to fail because you'd convinced yourself that your grandfather was right, that caring about people is a luxury businesses can't afford. Imani leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. You were protecting yourself from hoping for something better. Graham started, then stopped, his expression shifting as her words hit home. That's terrifyingly accurate. I know because I do the same thing. It's easier to expect disappointment than to risk believing things can change. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of mutual recognition settling between them. When Graham spoke again, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. You know what the worst part is? Watching your success this week has made me realize how much I've lost by choosing cynicism over hope. Not just in business, but, he trailed off, looking directly at her. In everything. Imani felt her breath catch. The air between them had shifted, becoming charged with something that had nothing to do with corporate politics and everything to do with the way Graham was looking at her, like she was a revelation he hadn't expected. Graham, she began, but her phone chose that moment to buzz with an incoming call. Alfred's name appeared on the screen. I should take this, she said apologetically. He's been a friend who's been helping me through this whole process. Graham nodded, but something in his expression shuddered slightly as she answered the call. Alfred, it's kind of late. Is everything okay? I'm fine, my dear, though I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about second chances and making amends. Alfred's voice carried an urgency she hadn't heard before. Now I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course. This young man you're working with, the CEO, what's his name? Imani glanced at Graham, who was pretending to study her charts while obviously listening to her side of the conversation. Graham Ellison. Why? The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that Imani thought the call had dropped. Alfred, are you there? Yes, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I'm here. Imani, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you from the beginning. What is it? Graham Ellison is my grandson. The words hit Imani like a physical blow. She stared at Graham, seeing Alfred's sharp blue eyes reflected in his face, the same stubborn set to his jaw, the same intelligence that seemed to pierce through surface appearances. Do you're Alfred Whitmore? She breathed. Across from her, Graham went completely still, his face draining of color as the implications hit him. Yes, Alfred said, and I think it's time my grandson and I had a conversation. The silence in Imani's cubicle stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Graham sat frozen, his face cycling through shock, recognition, and something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. Imani clutched her phone, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "I can explain." Alfred's voice came through the speaker, gentler now but urgent. "Please, both of you, let me explain." "Both of us?" Imani's voice came out strangled. "You knew he was here. You knew I was talking about him this whole time." "Yes." Graham finally found his voice, though it came out harsh and raw. "How long have you been manipulating this situation, old man?" "Graham." Alfred's voice cracked slightly on his grandson's name. "I've been trying to find a way to bridge the gap between us for 5 years. When Imani helped me that morning, when I saw the kind of person she was, I thought maybe she could help us both see what we'd lost." "So you used me," Imani said, her professional composure finally cracking. You used my kindness, my trust, to orchestrate some kind of family reunion." "No," Alfred said firmly. "Everything I told you about change, about second chances, about the importance of what you were doing, all of that was real. I believe in you, Imani. I believe in what you've accomplished." Graham stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked Chicago's glittering skyline. "This is unbelievable. Even from you, this level of manipulation is—" "I was dying, Graham." The word stopped Graham mid-stride. Imani felt her breath catch. "What?" Graham's voice was barely a whisper. "3 months ago, I had a heart attack. A serious one. The doctors said it was a warning that I needed to reduce stress, make peace with my life." Alfred's voice grew thick with emotion. "I realized I might not have much time left to fix the biggest mistake I ever made." "Which was what?" Graham asked, though he didn't turn around. "Choosing pride over love, choosing to be right over being your grandfather." Imani watched Graham's shoulders sag. 5 years of anger warring with evident pain. She felt like an intruder in this moment, but also like the only bridge between two people who had forgotten how to reach each other. "But the morning I helped you," she said quietly into the phone, "you were coming from seeing Graham, weren't you? The old colleague you had words with." "Yes." "I went to his apartment, tried to apologize, tried to explain that I wanted him to take over the company, really take over, not just implement my outdated policies. But I handled it badly, said all the wrong things." Alfred's voice grew heavy with regret. "He told me it was too late for apologies, that I'd already chosen my legacy. He wasn't wrong." Graham finally turned around, his face a map of conflicting emotions. "You came to my apartment to offer me the company. I came to offer you the chance to make it what we both knew it could be, what you always said it should be." Alfred paused. "And when you rejected that offer, when you walked away, I realized I'd failed you so completely that you couldn't even believe I might have changed. Because you spent 30 years teaching me that profit mattered more than people," Graham said, but his voice had lost its edge. "You taught me that sentiment was weakness, that caring about employees was a luxury we couldn't afford. And I was wrong. God help me, I was wrong about so much." Imani found herself speaking before she realized it. "That's why you asked me if people could really change. You were trying to figure out if it was too late for you." "Partly, yes, but mostly I was trying to understand if my grandson could forgive a foolish old man who'd let fear and pride destroy the most important relationship in his life." Graham sank back into his chair, running his hands through his hair. "So what now? What was the end game here, Alfred? You help Imani save the company culture, prove that your way was wrong, and suddenly we're a happy family again." "There was no end game," Alfred said quietly. "Just hope. Hope that seeing someone fight for what you used to believe in might remind you why you cared in the first place. Hope that maybe if I could help the woman who showed me kindness, I might earn a chance to show that same kindness to you." Imani looked between her phone and Graham's face, seeing the family resemblance more clearly now, not just in their features, but in their stubborn determination and their capacity for both fierce loyalty and devastating wounded pride. "I feel like an idiot," she said finally. All this time, I've been getting advice about changing corporate culture from the man who created the corporate culture I was trying to change. You're not an idiot, Graham said, his voice gentler than she'd heard it all evening. You're the only person in this situation who acted with complete honesty. I'm sorry, Alfred said, and the weight of decades seemed to press down on those two words. I'm sorry to both of you. Imani, you deserved to know the truth from the beginning. Graham, you deserved an apology 5 years ago, not a manipulation disguised as one. Graham stared at the phone for a long moment, then looked at Imani. Something passed between them, a recognition of shared hurt, maybe, or shared hope. Alfred, Graham said finally, are you really sick? I'm really sick, son, and I'm really sorry. And I'm really proud of what you've both accomplished this week, even if I had to orchestrate the circumstances to see it happen. The pilot program, Imani said suddenly, realization dawning. You wanted Graham to see that his original instincts were right, that companies could be profitable and humane. I wanted him to remember who he was before I taught him to be someone else, Alfred admitted. And I wanted to see if the woman who would help a stranger in the rain might be exactly what this family needed. Graham looked at Imani, and she saw something new in his expression, not just attraction or professional respect, but gratitude. Gratitude for seeing past his armor, for fighting for something he'd given up on, for being the catalyst that brought his grandfather back into his life. So what happens now? Imani asked. Now, Graham said, standing up and extending his hand to her, we go see my grandfather, together, and we figure out how to move forward with the truth instead of pride. As Imani took his hand, feeling the warmth and strength of his fingers intertwined with hers, she realized that Alfred's manipulation had given them all something precious, a second chance at the connections they'd thought were lost forever. Alfred, she said into the phone, yes, my dear, we're coming to see you, and you'd better have some of that wisdom you keep talking about ready, because we're going to need it. Alfred's laugh sounded lighter than she'd heard it since the day they met. I'll put the coffee on. 3 weeks later, Imani stood in the transformed conference room of TechCore Solutions, watching the most unlikely board meeting in corporate history unfold before her. Alfred Whitmore sat at the head of the table where he belonged, looking frail but determined in a perfectly tailored suit that couldn't quite hide how much weight he'd lost. Graham sat to his right, no longer the cold, calculating CEO who'd threatened mass layoffs, but a man who'd remembered what it meant to lead with both his head and his heart. The pilot program results speak for themselves, Graham was saying to the assembled board members, his voice carrying a confidence that came from conviction rather than arrogance. Productivity is up 18% across all participating departments. Customer satisfaction has reached a 3-year high. And perhaps most importantly, voluntary turnover has dropped to near zero. Imani felt a surge of pride as she watched him present her work, their work, with the kind of passion she'd only dreamed of seeing from corporate leadership. But it was Alfred's expression that made her heart swell, pure grandfather's pride, as he watched his grandson fight for the values they'd both lost and found again. The numbers are impressive, said Carol Henderson from the board, though her tone suggested she was looking for a catch. But what about implementation costs, training expenses, the disruption to existing protocols? I'm glad you asked, Imani said, stepping forward with the confidence that came from knowing she was absolutely right. The total implementation cost for company-wide adoption would be approximately $1.2 million over the first year. Our projected savings from reduced turnover, increased productivity, and improved client retention, $4.8 million annually. She clicked to the next slide, revealing a comprehensive breakdown that had taken her 2 weeks to perfect. More importantly, we're not talking about disrupting protocols. We're talking about replacing systems that haven't worked for years with ones that actually serve our employees and our clients. The room fell silent as the board absorbed the implications. Finally, Robert Chen, The same board member who'd pushed for the original restructuring leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Miss Fields, when you first challenged our efficiency model, I thought you were naive at best, delusional at worst." He paused, shaking his head in apparent amazement. "I've never been happier to be proven wrong." As the formal vote to adopt Imani's approach company-wide passed unanimously, she felt Graham's hand find hers under the table, squeezing gently. The gesture was subtle enough to maintain professionalism, but intimate enough to remind her of everything that had changed between them over the past 3 weeks. After Alfred's revelation, they'd spent hours at his lakeside home, talking, arguing, laughing, and slowly rebuilding the bridges that pride had burned. Imani had watched Graham transform as he reconnected with his grandfather. Seeing the man he'd been before corporate cynicism had hardened his heart. And somewhere in those long conversations about family, forgiveness, and the courage to hope for better, she'd fallen completely in love with both the CEO who challenged her and the man who trusted her enough to be vulnerable. "There's one more item of business," Alfred said as the meeting began to wind down. "As you all know, I've been serving as interim consultant during this transition, but effective immediately. I'm stepping down from all operational duties and officially passing full leadership of Tech Core Solutions to my grandson, Graham Ellison." He stood, his movements careful but dignified, and placed a hand on Graham's shoulder. "I built this company on the belief that success meant making the hard choices, even when those choices hurt people. My grandson is going to build it on the belief that success means making the right choices, especially when those choices require courage." The applause that followed felt different from the polite corporate approval Imani was used to. It felt genuine, hopeful, like the sound of people who actually believed in what they were working toward. As the board members filed out, congratulating each other on what felt like a historic decision, Imani found herself alone with Graham and Alfred in the conference room that had once felt like a corporate courtroom and now felt like the beginning of something beautiful. "So," Alfred said, settling back into his chair with a mischievous glint in his eyes that reminded Imani exactly where Graham had gotten his stubborn streak. "When do I get to meet this famous grandmother I've heard so much about?" Imani laughed, the sound echoing off the glass walls. "Actually, she's been asking about you too. Apparently, she has some strong opinions about your matchmaking techniques." "I can't wait to hear them," Alfred replied, "though I should probably warn her that I'm terrible at bridge." "That's okay," Graham said, pulling Imani closer with an ease that still made her heart skip. "She'll teach you. Fair warning, though, she doesn't believe in letting people win just to be polite." "Good," Alfred said, standing up with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned to treasure every moment. "I've had enough of people being polite when they should be honest." As they walked out of TechCore together, 3 people who'd found each other through a combination of kindness, stubbornness, and the kind of coincidence that only happened when the universe decided to take matters into its own hands, Imani felt her phone buzz with a text. It was from Jessica. "Did you really just revolutionize corporate America and get the guy? Because if so, I'm buying you the biggest bottle of champagne Chicago has ever seen." Imani looked at Graham, who was listening intently to Alfred's story about his first board meeting 40 years ago, and at Alfred, who was gesturing with the enthusiasm of someone who'd rediscovered the joy of family. She thought about Grandma Rose waiting at home with her inevitable questions and unsolicited advice. About the 20 TechCore employees who would go to work tomorrow, knowing their jobs were secure and their contributions valued. About the hundreds more who would benefit from the changes they'd fought so hard to implement. "Actually," she typed back to Jessica, "I think I got something even better." "What's that?" "A chance to prove that love really is more powerful than fear." 6 months later, as Imani stood in Grandma Rose's garden watching Alfred teach Graham how to properly tend to roses, while Rose directed them both with the authority of a general commanding troops, she realized that some storms were worth weathering, especially when they brought exactly the people you needed into your life. And when Graham looked up from the rosebush, he was carefully pruning, dirt smudged on his cheek and love shining in his eyes as he smiled at her. Imani knew that sometimes the best things in life began with the simple decision to help a stranger in the rain. The end. Thanks for watching to the end. Did you like the story? Tell us what you thought in the comments below. We want to know what you think. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe now for more exciting stories you won't want to miss. Activate the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. See you in the next story. See you there.